Hi, I'm Mark Anthony. I'm known as Mark Anthony JD Psychic Explorer. JD is my law degree, Juris Doctorate, and the media has traditionally labeled me the psychic lawyer, but because of my work with ancient mysteries, supernatural phenomenon, and mysticism, I travel around the world to mystical, spiritual locations and examine them. And so I speak at several conferences on a wide variety of topics, everything from near-death experiences to reincarnation to the science of spirit communication. Near-death experiences have been a part of my family for as long as I can remember. My father had two near-death experiences. My mother had one. I had one. Um, My dad was 16 years old and he was in a terrible car accident. And he said the next thing he knew, he was looking down and he was hovering about 30, 40 feet above the car. And he saw these people pull his body out and they were working on him, I guess, doing compressions. And he said he had this floating feeling and he looked away from where his body was and he said he saw this brilliant light and he felt this floating sensation. He goes, I'm dead. This is really great. I remember he was explaining, he goes, I feel great. And then he heard a voice and the voice spoke to him. And he told me, and he described this to me several times, said it wasn't the voice that you hear in your head. It was a different voice. He goes, it was very calm. And the voice said, Earl, it is not your time. You have to go back. And he said, the next thing I knew, I was in my body, and he goes, and it hurt like hell. He said, I mean, he was banged up pretty bad, and he was sitting there, hyperventilating, and they were like, oh my God, he's breathing. Well, about 10 years later, and this is after my dad got out of the military, and my dad saw some pretty heavy combat. And he said that one of the most terrifying abilities that he had is before they go into combat, he would notice around, and he was in the Navy, he noticed around some of the sailors, but usually the Marines, because Marines are always on Navy ships. They're the ground troops for the Navy. He would see this black outline. And he said it terrified him. And every time he saw that, they died. And I remember saying to him, well, why didn't you say something? He goes, Mark, what was I going to say? I was 18, 19 years old. He said they would have thrown me in the brig, that it was Section 8'd me for being insane. He goes, I didn't fully understand what it was. And now I understand my dad is able to see auras, and he was seeing the aura of when someone's going to die. And throughout my whole life, we'd be somewhere and he'd look away and I go, what? And he'd point to somebody. We'd be at a store or something. He goes, that woman over there, that man over there. He goes, I'm seeing it. And it really really freaked him out. Well, 10 years later, I think he was in probably around 26 or 27. And he was also a diver. In fact, my dad actually went scuba diving at one time with the legendary Jacques Cousteau. And I remember I was talking to my brother recently, and once again, this is before I was born. My brother said, Dad took me to the dive shop with him. I was about 5, and he goes, there was this guy there that spoke. He was talking really weird. What he was describing is Jacques Cousteau had a very thick French accent because, he was French. But my brother said, now I realize I met Jacques Cousteau when I was 5 years old. And he goes, that is so cool. And my father said on one dive, Cousteau wasn't there on this one, they were off the coast of New Jersey, and Dad said they were in about 125 feet of water. And he said all of a sudden his regulator malfunctioned. And he said he couldn't breathe. And he said that was it. He goes, in those days, it wasn't like now where they have backup systems and some type of emergency air. He started sucking water. My dad said I was drowning. And he goes, and he said, and all of a sudden there was that white light again and that floating sensation. And he said, and I felt great again. And I felt that I was leaving my body. And the voice returned. And the voice said, Earl, it's not your time. You have to go back. And my dad said he could never understand how or why this happened, but his regulator started working. He said, Mark, that was a mechanical impossibility in those days. He goes, all of a sudden, air started coming out of it. And being an expert diver at a SEAL, he knew how to clear his mask. And he also knew that you can't, make a beeline to the surface because then you'll get nitrogen narcosis, which are the bends. But he took his time and he got back to the surface. And it wasn't long after that, especially when my mom found out, that she kind of put the kibosh on him diving. But and I remember when I was in my teens, I wanted to scuba dive, and Dad said, "Oh no, you don't." Dad was he was always very protective of me, and he said, "No." He goes, "Mark," he said, "there's no margin for error." And I said, "Yeah, but what about that?" He goes, "Mark, that," he goes, "was nothing short of a miracle." Well, when I was in my teens, um, my mother she was an artist. She was so intelligent. She was a ballroom dancer. Both my parents were. She was elegant. I always like to joke, and my dad said she was like a combination of Elizabeth Taylor, Grace Kelly. He said, um, Ginger Rogers, and he goes, and Muhammad Ali kind of rolled into one. And he said, and the humor of Lucille Ball. My mom was just a real elegant person, but she was also plagued by horrible medical conditions her entire life. And out of respect for her, I'm not going to go through it all. But when I was 17, she doubled over in pain. She had to be rushed to the hospital, and her intestines actually burst. My mother had severe Crohn's disease in addition to other medical conditions. And I remember being at the hospital, and the surgeon came out and they said, "I think we're going to lose her. I think we're going to lose her." And I'll never forget my dad. All of a sudden, he went from being dad to the Navy SEAL, and he grabbed the surgeon by the front of his shirt and he said, "If she dies, you die." And I remember this doctor's like, "How dare you?" And dad goes, "You get the blank back in there and save my wife." And the surgeon went back in, and my mom had flatlined. She was dead for like 5 minutes, and they were massaging her heart, and she came back. But mom told me that when she had died, she left her body and she went into the light through a tunnel, and she was greeted by Giovanna, her grandmother, and also her father. And I could tell stories about her father as well. And she was so happy to see them. And they said, and they both spoke with Italian accents. And she said, they go, "Jeannie, it is not your time. You got to go back." And that was, she said the next thing she knew, because she was heavily, she was under anesthesia. Next thing she remembered was like a day later when she came out of the coma of the anesthesia. And so my whole life, I've been around near-death experiences, and especially my dad. I mean, when his near-death experiences occurred, they didn't even have the term. They didn't know what it was. And then I remember reading this magazine about near-death experiences. It was an interview with Dr. Raymond Moody, and it was talking about his findings. And I remember I showed that to my mother, and she goes, "Yeah, I've heard about this." And she said, "I think that's what I experienced. I think that's what your father experienced." And so we were always very interested in that. And, we've always been very attuned to near-death experiences and to afterlife research. So, and then, of course, when I was 4, I had my NDE, and which I go into great detail in the afterlife frequency. But I think it's more interesting to understand the scientific basis for near-death experiences, and I also go into that in great detail in the afterlife frequency and my theory called the electromagnetic soul. And I'll just make this very brief. Every great belief system teaches us that the soul, the who and what we are, pre-exists the body, comes into the body, moves on after the body dies. They all teach that. We know from the laws of thermodynamics and physics that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. We know from neuroscience that the brain is only 2% of the body's weight, but it consumes over 20% of the body's electromagnetic energy. And it's the most complex electrical system in the body. So I developed the term electromagnetic soul to describe in 21st century terms what we really are, which is pure consciousness, a spirit, a soul, which is eternal electromagnetic energy. And so that when we die, think of our soul as a drop of water, and it leaves the brain and plunges into the eternal sea of consciousness that I refer to as the collective consciousness. However, sometimes these drops of water bounce back. And that's when a near-death experience is, because it occurs between our material world frequency. Okay, everything on the quantum level vibrates. Everything's made of molecules, which are made of atoms, which in turn are electrons, protons, neutrons, which in turn made of the smallest particle, a quantum. Okay, and so when we leave the material world, we quantum leap to the afterlife frequency, which you can call nirvana, heaven, the afterlife, whatever you want to refer to. But the zone in between, which I refer to as the NDE zone, is where all forms of spirit communication occur. Mediumship, deathbed visions, after-death communication, near-death, and shared-death experiences. And that's why my theories depart from what other mediums are in their books, because mine presents a scientific explanation based on sound scientific principles, how our electromagnetic soul, our spirit, is a coherent quantum field that survives physical death. And that also provides the basis for how we are able to detect, perceive, and even communicate with spirits. Mediumship, the ability to communicate with the other side, it is part of my DNA. When I'm introduced, people say, you're a fourth generation psychic medium, and then people want to know, what does that mean? What I've been able to determine is there have been people with these abilities, the psychic and mediumistic abilities, in my family at least since the 1890s on both sides of the family. And I'm assuming that it goes even further back in time than that, but finding the stories and, of course, the people that could tell me about the folks back in the early part of the 20th centuries have long since passed. What happens is, based on my experience, the research I've done, and the science that I've worked with, is that these abilities appear to be genetic. And it's what's known as a recessive genetic trait. In other words, a dominant genetic trait would be like being right-handed. 90+% of the people in the world are right-handed. Being left-handed, it's a genetic determination whether or not you're going to be left-handed. Only roughly 10% of the people in the world are. And so a recessive trait can skip a generation or two. Well, in my family, since it runs on both sides, when two parents with the same recessive genetic trait have children, the likelihood of at least one of them having that recessive trait increases exponentially, and that would be me. I have an older brother and an older sister. I wasn't planned. My parents always said I was a surprise. They had me a bit later in life, and my dad was a U.S. Navy SEAL. Okay, this is a very no-nonsense guy. And after the Navy, he went into aerospace, became an aerospace engineer. He was instrumental in the space program. We could do a whole show just on my father. And it's hard to get more serious than a Navy SEAL. And he was a science guy, but he had the ability to detect, to hear, and to see spirits. And his family, they were very white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Pennsylvania and very conservative in their demeanor. My father had four siblings, three sisters and a brother, and one of his sisters, Marjorie, also had this ability, as did their their mother, Isabel, and their maternal grandmother, Grace. So they had, there's one, two, three generations right there, then me's the fourth. On my mother's side of the family, they had come over to the United States from Italy. And my maternal great grandmother, her name was Giovanna, fascinating woman. And she was married to this young engineer from Naples. His name was Nunzio Pontillo. And it was probably around 1889, 1899, just right around the turn of the century. The part of Italy that they lived in, people were starving. It was very poor. It was the tip of the toe of the boot of Italy. And the town, the name of the town was Calabria. Actually, the name of the town is Sheila, and Reggio Calabria is the province that they're from. Anyway, Nunzio said that he was going to New York and he was going to get a job, make enough money to bring Giovanna over. So she's a young bride, beautiful woman, and one night she woke up screaming. And her parents came in. They couldn't console her. They didn't know what was going on. She said, "It's Nunzio. It's Nunzio. Oh my God, I think he's dead. I think he's dead." Unbeknownst to anyone, he had been killed in an industrial accident in Brooklyn. There was this giant tank, this metal tank. I think it was a water tank, and because the Italians were treated basically as slave labor, they sent the Italian workers underneath to put the supports in for the tank. Something happened, and the tank collapsed, and it crushed about a dozen men, Nunzio being one of them. And at the precise moment of his death, Giovanna knew it. He came to her. And so then when Giovanna came over to the United States, she eventually married the gentleman that became that was my great grandfather. And she was known in the Italian American community of North New Jersey and New York City as the woman who knows things. And when nuns were coming into the United States from Italy, she would house them and console them and counsel them and help them get situated in the convent. Officials from the Catholic Church used to consult with her, all the way from priests up to cardinals. And she had this almost a very sacred demeanor about her. In fact, in 2016, PBS, the public broadcasting system, did a special called The Italian Americans. It was a two-night special. It was about, I think, 4 or 5 hours long. They actually did an entire segment on Giovanna, and they referenced her psychic abilities. So it was really cool seeing that on TV with all these pictures of my family members. And I remember when it was on, like my cousins, every commercial, they'd be calling, "Did you see that?" And it was really great being able to share that. And on the Italian side of the family, then my mother inherited these abilities. My mother was amazing. She had precognitive ability. She could foresee future events. She could perceive spirits and communicate with spirits. So my dad gets out of the Navy and he goes to a USO dance. And here he is, a young, sailor. And my dad was a real handsome guy. I mean, real seriously, have you ever seen a Navy SEAL that, wasn't good? I don't know where they get these guys. And, my dad was one of them. And he said, "So there I am at this dance, and I see this foxy looking dame." And he's talking about my mom. Now, he was 2 years older than her. But what it was, my mother worked at this high-end department store. And so she was in fashion, design, and window, and she was an artist. She was a commercial artist. So mom said she always got the designer styles wholesale. So mom was always dressed to the nines, and he goes, "Here I am thinking this dame is like 30 years old," and he finds out she's 19. But anyway, they started dancing, and both my parents, and it was so funny, they've since crossed to the other side, but they said that as soon as they met, they knew that there was something, and it was more than just a physical attraction. They were both very, very beautiful people. And my mom was a good Italian girl. Okay, so everything was proper, and but on the third or fourth time they met at a dance, my mother said, and my father's name was Earl, her name was Jean. She said, Earl, before we go any further, there's something I need to tell you. I see spirits. Now, of course, my dad responded as only a sailor could with several colorful metaphors, followed by, I do too. And then they realized, okay, now we know why we're tuning into each other so much. But the two families could not have been more different. My mother's side of the family, the Italians, they called this the gift of second sight. It was a vision from the Holy Spirit. And that's why the Catholic community was so welcoming to my great grandmother. And if you notice, most of the high profile mediums in the United States, and it could be elsewhere in the world as well, including myself, were raised in the Catholic faith. And I don't think it's necessarily um, Catholicism that makes people psychic. What I think it is in the Catholic Church, we have angels, we have saints, we have Mother Mary, we have an acknowledgement that spirits are a part of our life. And most Catholics are not chapter, line, and verse. If it doesn't say this, and a lot of the Catholics don't necessarily take the Bible literally, but more metaphorically. So the people who are chapter, line, and verse, and I'm not putting anyone down because everybody has a right to their own belief system, but what it is, that tends to restrict your belief system, and it also creates a block. It creates a block. Anyway, that's what I've seen through my experience. So here I am, 3.5 years old. I was a surprise. They weren't supposed to have me. In fact, they almost didn't because when I was born, I wasn't breathing. I was what's known as a blue baby. And my mother told me that the doctor said he's not breathing. And she started shouting at them. She said, "You work on him." And they figured they'd humor her. And so they started whacking my fanny, rubbing my back. And all of a sudden I started coughing. And so I went from being blue to, I started breathing. So from day one, I had a pretty tough time. Between when I was born and 5 years old, I almost died on four occasions. One of which was my near-death experience, which I go into great detail in my book, The Afterlife Frequency. But when I was around 3.5 years old, I started seeing spirits. And I thought they were my invisible friends, and I'd interact with them and talk to them. And I remember my mother going, "Oh, he's got it." And my father going, geez, he's got it." And the reactions were very different. Mom was all kind of excited that, oh, he has the family ability. And my father was not happy about this. And he always told me, you can tell your mother and I about this. You can talk to us about it all you want, but don't tell anyone outside of the family. And I started first grade when I was 5. And I remember my dad saying, do not talk about anybody about this because people who see things other people don't get taken away. Well, that really scared me. And I was like, and I never understood why. And he could see I was scared. And I remember he held me. My dad, he was a tough guy, Navy SEAL, but he was a very loving father. And he held me and he said, it's for your own protection. What I found out is about 20 years before I was born, his sister Marjorie, that was, he had three sisters and a brother. And one of his sisters was a very gifted psychic medium. And she was also able to foresee future events. Unfortunately for her, she married this guy who was essentially a religious fanatic. He was evangelical, chapter, line, and verse, um, denied her ability, didn't like it at all. And one day he was ready to go to work, and he worked as a machinist at a steel plant in Pennsylvania. And she begged him not to go to work. She said something terrible is going to happen, and she was clutching her stomach, her solar plexus. And that's one of the, and once again, in my books, I explain the areas in your body that are the psychic receptors. And she threw a fit and started crying, and they had a big fight. He goes, fine, I'll stay home. You and that voodoo stuff of yours. He was furious at her. Well, that day, at the steel plant, this crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams, and suddenly the cable snapped, and the beams crushed the machine shop that he worked in and killed everybody in it. Now, one would think that he would have been grateful, thankful that her precognitive ability saved his life. Instead, it intensified his fear of these abilities, and he conspired with an unscrupulous psychiatrist who diagnosed my Aunt Marjorie as a paranoid schizophrenic. And literally, they sent an ambulance to their home. 2 men in white coats came out, forcibly removed her from her home, put her in a straitjacket. They took her to a mental institution where she was subjected against her will to electroshock therapy for over a period of 6 months. They did so much damage to her brain that she never again talked about seeing spirits or seeing the future again. And the sad part is I never met my Aunt Marjorie in this world, but she comes to me a lot. And I write about that extensively in my books, Evidence of Eternity and the Afterlife Frequency, about how it's always when there's danger, Aunt Marjorie shows up, and she's like there to mark, be on guard. So it was not until I was in my 20s that I had discovered all of this. And that's why I realized my father was like, don't tell anybody about this, you'll get taken away. He wasn't trying to be mean to me. He was trying to protect me. If you'd like to find out more about my experiences, my theories, please visit my website, which is afterlifefrequency.com, just like my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency. I have 3 books, Never Letting Go, which is a guide on the journey through grief, Evidence of Eternity, and the Afterlife Frequency. And all my books bridge the gap between the spiritual and the scientific. They've been endorsed by some of the top near-death experience researchers and survival of consciousness scientists in the world. And when you visit my website, afterlifefrequency.com, I invite you to sign up for my newsletter. And also, I have a weekly live stream show, The Psychic and the Doc, where we take calls from listeners, and my co-host is the world-renowned behavioral psychologist, Dr. Pat Basili. You can find out about all of that at afterlifefrequency.com. And I want to thank everybody for listening and tuning in. Namaste. God bless.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.